this is where it gets concerning also if you've been on this channel long enough, you know that I don't like DEI statements because I do think of them as ideological litmus tests, because frankly they are. But that's a topic that's covered extensively in another video, by the way. I will get to that. I won't get into that here, but if you're forced to lie about it, that is one great way to show that you don't necessarily deserve public trust if you're willing to lie about such things in grants. So in the vein of public trust in science and scientists and universities more broadly, because why do we talk about them too? They are the place where we train the next generation of scientists at this moment. And so this came across my radar from the Toronto Sun, actually, and it's an interesting piece in thinking about some of the ideologically driven requirements that have shown up in papers and in DEI statements at universities, and most worryingly, starting to make appearances in requirements for grants. Now, just as a brief recap reminder for those of you who might need to know, is that oftentimes what will happen is that an agency or an entity will put out a request for proposals. A scientist, builds a proposal, submits that proposal, and, if theirs is the best proposal according to the selection criteria and expert review and all that jazz, then their project is funded by the agency for however long in the proposal and the budget and all that kind of jazz. But what is being increasingly put in as requirements, or at least it seems to be increasingly so, at least for the Canadians, as you might guess, is requirements that you should be doing something DEI related or diversity, equity, inclusion related, just to say not related to your grant proposal at all as part of your grant. And so that is where this came up, because it highlights an interesting point that I want to make here in terms of, you want to do science, but you got to deal with these requirements that have nothing to do with your scientific interests or the questions you're trying to answer, anything like that, and how much of a detriment that might be. This is written by Jeff Horsman. Scientists and engineers to public, save us from ourselves. Whoa. Hello. So ads all over the place. My colleague, a fellow academic scientist, said, I have made my peace with EDI, which is another way to say diversity, equity, inclusion. It's just rearranged the letters. I will lie about my most deeply held beliefs or convictions on paper in order to get funding. You have to realize something. A lot of these scientists, they do not get hard salaries from their respective universities. They're what's called, what is often referred to in the jargon as soft money funded. They require those grants to pay their salaries. And so if a lot of this kind of ideologically driven stuff ends up in grant proposal requirements, well, then you got a choice to make, right? Oh, goodness. Can I turn this ad off? There we go. We were discussing equity, diversity, and inclusion statements, which researchers must write to get jobs and government research grants. These grants fund the specialized infrastructure, materials, and expertise especially critical in science and engineering research. Infrastructure being, of course, lab equipment and things like that, field equipment if you're doing things out of the lab, if it were, but things like that. Although the requisite components of a good EDI statement can vary, typically one must profess in the unfalsifiable claims of systemic racism and sexism and describe plans for corrective action. This might include actively recruiting marginalized students or requiring EDI training on other unfalsifiable concepts like implicit bias or microaggressions. Now, I will say this is in part an opinion piece, of course. Such is the state of science funding in Canada. University professors are resigned to lying to access research funds. And such is the thing. This is the thing. When you're being asked to sign a statement to something that goes against your own values and we'll get to that in a little bit more in a second, what do you do with that, particularly as it's part of your livelihood? Although among EDI statement tripwires to avoid are espousing classically liberal or conservative values. For example, a stated commitment to colorblind evaluation of students will get your grant rejected. As another example, my colleagues considered an EDI statement deficient because the applicant believed in holding all students to a high standard. When I asked why this was a bad thing, I received no clear answers, but rather the distinct impression that I had transgressed. But maybe I did get a clear answer. If you believe in merit and competency, shut up. An engineering professor recently told me that, quote, engineers will say anything, end quote, to get a grant, joking they'd throw their own mothers under the bus if it improved their prospects. It seems throwing their principles comes just as easy. And this is the thing. If you're lying, essentially, on a grant, well, if you have certain specific principles, but you're lying to get the grant, well, congratulations, you're throwing your principles out with this. This is scrolling really, really slowly. Goodness, what a horrible bunch of ads on this site. Apologies. If this sounds like inconsequential inside baseball, I can assure you that the practical consequences of EDI are extremely serious. Because EDI initiatives strive to socially engineer outcomes by race and sex, they require racial and sexual discrimination. Let's see. I want to go down a little bit here because I have read this. Now, in his essay, The Power of the Powerless, on the evils of communist regimes, Václav Havel describes dispirited merchants being forced to display Communist Party signs to stay in business. Similarly, the compelled enthusiastic support for EDI demoralizes our nation's scientists and engineers. The end result is that Canada's scientific and technical innovators either support racial discrimination, don't care, or disagree but are willing to lie about it in writing. We scientists fully deserve any loss of public trust coming our way, but we are incapable of self-reform and desperately need the public to step in, give us a pep talk, and hold us accountable. Now, this is actually the section of this that I wanted to come to, which is why I skipped a little bit in here, but I encourage you to go back and read it and, say your own thoughts respectfully. So say your own thoughts, as it were. But here's the thing about it. Forced support for something, with DEI statements, whether they be in grants or for jobs or for applications to a college, even for students or anything like that, being forced to say something against your own values in order to do something is very demoralizing. And so there's other things that will happen with this. I think there's one other option aside from the thing they said there, in that you'll probably have some scientists go running for the door, or you'll have other scientists who are just, going to go along to get along, despite the fact that they really shouldn't at this point. This is an option where you should stand up and say, no, I'm not going to say this. And basically, because it is violations of academic freedom to say that you have to espouse this particular viewpoint. That doesn't fly with the university, at least in the US. This is in Canada. But it's not supposed to fly anyway. But that is the problem. And the other thing is for students who are having to put up with this kind of stuff, for students doing applications of this. He's talking about faculty, for students who have to put up for this particular thing. I suspect those students who do have strong values for individualism, as it were, will go running for the door with this kind of thing themselves and just never become amazing scientists that they could have been, or engineers that they could have been, when they're forced to espouse a belief that they don't necessarily share, or that they have some questions about, but like the commentary above, might get the feeling that you shouldn't have asked, if you will. And so many other surveys have talked about at this point, how things are on college campuses, that is a concern, right? And so this is the problem with the public trust aspect of it also, because if you're willing to lie on a grant, that is a way to say that you don't necessarily deserve the trust of the public. Because again, with this public grants, that's taxpayer dollars, essentially. So that's a problem. Now the thing is, of course, you could just not lie, but then what do you do? Because you are stuck in the thing of you're soft money funded. You need funding, right? Well, I mean, my kind of thought maybe it's time to take the hit. If you shouldn't compromise on your values with these things and be forced into abandoning your principles for the funding. You should stick by your principles. But I do totally understand the frustration and concern that I can't get funding. I can't get funding. I need this to get funding at this point. So what do? Because the grant funding, because you're soft money funded, it's the grant funding that ultimately pays your salary. And if you're supporting a family and all that kind of thing on down, I can totally understand the temptation to go along to get the grant that you need, because, well, it's just the practical thing of I've got a family to take care of, or I've got to take care of myself. So that is a point in this that I want to hit with this. So I understand, I'm sympathetic to that, but at the same time, going along to get along is not the right solution here. And I would very much like the scientists in Canada who are having to put up with us to say no, to basically band together and say no, or to figure out how to work around the system requirements in Canada, or basically, maybe like a mass brain drain from Canada, if you will, might actually be very helpful in this situation from them. But, I have seen a lot of good things lately with different groups saying, look, this is a problem. This is going to cause loss of trust. Doesn't necessarily help. We'll get to that in a second with this particular article. But seen a lot of that come up in the United States recently, which is great to see with this. But at the same time, as it's great to see that, I haven't seen it necessarily too much for Canada pushing back on that. Pushing back on this kind of stuff. So it is a concern. Now, I'm not going to say with one thing, if it was ideologically driven in any particular way that is unrelated to scientist work, no. You shouldn't be forcing that down a scientist's throat to begin with for a grant or for a job. Regardless, this is not specifically about EDI itself. You shouldn't be doing it, period, with that. But anyway, speaking of DEI itself, specifically, or EDI as it's referred to in here. This, come on. There we go. To this end, 2 reports published last week offer some clarity and hope for a path forward. The first was a concise summary of empirical evidence for EDI training. The report, authored by Laurier professor David Haskell, pointed out that EDI training does not work and even increases bigotry. I think that actually might be the report that Deb and I talked about briefly in our last live, but I can't remember. Politicians and institutional leaders can no longer feign ignorance and are now morally culpable for continued promotion of this dismal pseudoscience. The Haskell report provides a face-saving off-ramp for this self-destructive freeway. The second report, by Eric Kaufman, shows that Canadians 2-1 oppose the EDI worldview. Although this mirrors public opinion in both the USA and the UK, Canada is unique in having made no attempts at reform. Kaufman suggests that Canadians' unusually high trust in our progressive media keeps us from confronting EDI and its discriminatory practices. In short, the facts show that EDI doesn't work, and Canadians don't want it. At one time, empirical evidence meant something to our country's scientific researchers. Maybe it will again. I would question whether or not they know. Let's put it that way. Because most of us get so wrapped up in our own siloed disciplines, we, like everybody else, rely on the other experts. So, there is that kind of thing. But this is where it gets concerning also. If you've been on this channel long enough, you know that I don't like DEI statements because I do think of them as ideological litmus tests, because frankly they are. But that's a topic that's covered extensively in another video, by the way. I will get to that. I won't get into that here, but if you're forced to lie about it, that is one great way to show that you don't necessarily deserve public trust if you're willing to lie about such things in grants, instead of actually to stand up for it. So stand up for your principles, particularly to stand up for scientific norms. The normative principles, the Mertonian norms. Remember the KUDOS acronym? Communality, universalism, disinterestedness, organized skepticism. That is the fundamental scientific norms that you should be standing up for, particularly if you're in a STEM discipline. That's it for now. Let me know what you think. As always, this will be linked in the description. I'll be curious of your thoughts. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrienne. May you stay curious.